Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Championship Leadership. I'm excited today. We have Robb Wolf with us today. And Robb, he is a two-time New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat, is a former research biochemist and one of the world's leading experts in Paleolithic nutrition. Wolf has transformed the lives of tens of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked iTunes podcast and widely popular seminar series. I appreciate you so much for taking time. I know you're a busy man, and it's just excited to have you here with us today.
Huge honor to be here. I always feel like I should be taller than 5'9" with a bio like that.
Hang on a second,
so
you
thanks.
just went. I lost you there.
Am I here?
Yeah, now you are.
Okay. Yeah, you chopped just a little too, so okay. We'll keep our fingers crossed on the connection.
Yeah, but yeah, no, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So
absolutely.
The first question I love to get into here, the name of the podcast is Championship Leadership, and I always like to ask this: what comes to mind for you, or what does championship leadership mean to you when you hear that phrase?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I guess, leading by example might be the, maybe a little trite, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind with that. I see this with my kids. Like, I will try to provide feedback to them about what they're up to. And then later in the day, I'll realize that I am not actually doing the thing that I provided input to them to improve their life, and that's trying to remain aware of that, and then actually circle back and say, well, if that advice applied to them, it should probably apply to me too. And then it just provides that consistency also, because dude, kids are just so smart, and they pick up those little inconsistencies and they fixate on them and play with them and everything. And so I think, so leading by example, I think, is a big
I love it. Yeah. I mean, that's so true, right? And I was actually just talking about this on a different podcast of, as a coach myself, leading others, kind of helping them along the way. It's like, I want to make sure that I'm leading a life at its higher standard, if I'm going to tell others to do the same. And it's, I mean, it's just, as a parent, sometimes we can get caught in that, well, do as I say, but not as I do, right? Because they're always watching, and they're watching more of what we do than what it is that we say oftentimes. So yeah, I just love that. Well, tell me and tell the listeners a little bit more about you. Obviously, I've been following you for a long time. I've seen you on Joe Rogan's podcast. Been enjoying your book, and then also just I own a CrossFit gym, and so this conversation of nutrition and what you're doing and what you've been doing for people, I think, is amazing. So, but yeah, please give us maybe a little bit of a background on you and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Trying to keep it brief, but I was a research biochemist a very long time ago, had a pretty significant health crisis. I had ulcerative colitis so bad that they were looking at chopping large chunks of me out. And I was savvy enough with medicine to know that was a really bad idea. Like, I didn't want to head down that route. And doing some tinkering with my nutrition, I kind of got onto this paleo diet topic. And this was right around 1998 that I first started tinkering with this. Yeah. And around 2000, 2001, I was poking around online, and I found this kind of wacky workout called CrossFit. And my buddy and I, Dave Warner, who's a retired Navy SEAL, we started working out in his garage. And we were following the workout of the day. And within about 3 months, we had about 15 people that we were training in there. Like, just kind of word got out what we were doing. And before we knew it, we had a bunch of folks that we were training, and we really enjoyed it. And I wrote a letter to the Glassmans. I'd interacted with them a fair amount online, even at that very early date. But I wrote them a letter just basically saying, hey, we would like to open a gym. We'd like to call it CrossFit. Can we do that? And they said, yes, go be achieve. And that was the first CrossFit affiliate gym, CrossFit North, up in Seattle. And it was about 6 months later, I had an opportunity to move down to Chico, California, where I did my undergrad. And I opened what was then the fourth CrossFit affiliate gym in the world, CrossFit NorCal. And, if you do a Google Trends analysis, if you put in paleo diet and CrossFit, like, they lived and died together. They really went in lockstep with each other. But it was a really cool opportunity for me because I got to work with just thousands and thousands of people. And although working with elite athletes, it's cool, my real passion has been a significant illness, particularly autoimmune and gut related problems. And I think that that's because I've suffered from those. My mother ended up dying due to complications from those types of things, as did my wife's mother. So I had a real passion for that. And so even though we kind of had a shell of kind of elite athletes that we worked with, my core was just sick, broken people and trying to help them get healthier, because if we could change things for them, it might literally save their lives.
Yeah.
And so that led into the podcast, 2 New York Times bestselling books, doing consultations with everything from naval special warfare to NASA. And it's been really cool. And again, I think my comparative advantage in all this stuff is that I've really disproportionately looked at the health considerations of all this stuff. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can lose weight and get skinnier and stuff like that. But for people with autoimmune diseases and different gut illnesses, the food quality story is really where the rubber hits the road. Like eating less bad food is clearly better than eating more bad food. But at the end of the day, if somebody has terrible gluten or dairy intolerance, some amount may still be too much for them. And so I think that I've had a real disproportionate degree of success because I use this kind of ancestral health model that includes considerations of sleep and movement and community, as well as clearly the food.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. So I'm just thinking like, man, the first and the fourth CrossFit gym. And then of course, just the impact that you've made along the way. You know, some could say it's great timing, but also I just think as a leader, you're definitely a leader in this industry. And it's so challenging because like, man, there's so much information out there, and it's just like so confusing because every other day there's an expert that's coming out. And it's just good to see someone like yourself that's been there for literally from the beginning, for a very long time, showing up, consistent message, right? And of course, then there's the results that you help people get. But how hard is that? What's the battle like for that? Because it's tough for me because, you know, as someone that's always like trying to figure out that nutrition piece, and I guess I'm an athlete, but you know, kind of like a weekend warrior type athlete, staying fit and continuing to push and challenge myself, and then figure out how nutrition plays into that as well as being an entrepreneur and having 3 kids, you know, 11, 9, and 7. Like, you know, it's difficult and don't know what to believe. And what's that battle like for you as a leader in this charge to really help with the confusion that's out there?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So if you go into Google and you put in ketogenic diet, you'll get 1 million search returns in less than a minute. If you go to the second largest search engine in the world, YouTube, you get like 750,000 returns in less than a second.
Wow.
And so we're buried under information. This is an interesting factoid that I learned a couple of weeks ago. But if we look at everything that humanity knows, the totality of human knowledge, 90% of that was discovered in the last 2 years. And that's the way it's moving forward.
Wow.
It's growing exponentially, and the bulk of what we're learning has been learned very, very recently. So we're buried under information, but it's really fascinating. We know more about diabetes than we've ever known in our history, but yet rates continue to climb. And obesity, you know, we know more about this stuff. There were something like 30,000 peer-reviewed papers published on type 2 diabetes in 2016.
Wow.
But yet we're almost flat-footed in being able to deal with it, because I would go out on a limb and say that the things that we're recommending to people, the wisdom that we use to apply on this stuff is broken. We're just telling people the wrong thing. But a big challenge is that people are buried under information. There's so much information that it's kind of hard to stay on top of this stuff and has some wisdom about how can we pull something out of this. And again, for me, I use a couple of different worldviews or frameworks. You know, it's like different colored glasses that I put on to view the world. And I use the picture of kind of evolutionary biology, economics and thermodynamics, basically energy inputs and outputs. And that's the way that I begin looking at anything. So like if somebody came to me and they said, hey, ethanol made from corn is a great solution to long-term energy needs. I'd be like, okay, well, let's look at that. And how much energy do we put into making a certain amount of ethanol versus how much energy do we get out? And what we find is that the farmers that make ethanol for say like a gasoline additive, they run their tractors on gasoline because it takes more energy than you get out of it. And so that's a boondoggle. Like it's a complete boondoggle. And so this perspective of evolution, economics, and thermodynamics, it doesn't tell you everything, but I would make the case that if you're not starting a look at the world with those things as kind of your orienting compasses, it's magic and voodoo. Like you really don't have a reasonable ability to make some sense out of that stuff. So again, I think I've had a little bit of an advantage in that every time I'm presented a question about something, you know, so like there's a atherogenic blood protein, lipoprotein called lipoprotein A, LP little a. It's in the family of LDL particles, which are usually considered bad cholesterol. And people with high levels of LP little a, they do seem to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease. There's no doubt about that. But I was poking around thinking about it, and I'm like, well, what's the trade-off here? So what we find is that people with high levels of LP little a, they survive septic events much better than other people. So like if your pancreas or your appendix explodes and you end up with septicemia, people with high lipoprotein counts, high cholesterol counts tend to survive that better than people with low levels. So now there may be a trade-off. It may increase your cardiovascular disease risk in the long term, but as far as being able to mitigate infectious disease risk, it's actually a benefit. And so nothing in biology is a cut and dry, like, you know, this is a pure advantage. People that are really fast twitch and explosive tend not to have great endurance. Somebody that has great endurance tends not to be real, you know, twitchy and explosive. So I think being able to look at different things from that perspective and ask questions about like, well, what are we trying to do? What's the goal? People ask questions like, is fasting a good idea or not? It's like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what's the goal? You know, if you are somebody that has suffered from disordered eating and you're underweight and, you know, like you've had some anorexia, bulimia in your past or something like that, intermittent fasting is probably a terrible idea. If you are a high motor CrossFit Games competitor and you're doing 3 workouts a day, intermittent fasting is probably a terrible idea because you're already pushing your body to the absolute limit. If you're kind of a mellow type B personality computer programmer that's sedentary, intermittent fasting is probably the bee's knees, you know? And so it's amidst all of this information, I think a good way to make sense of it is, again, finding these overarching frameworks, but then just being very specific about what do you want to get? Like, what's the goal? What type of risk do you want to mitigate and stuff like that? And then we can usually construct a plan. And then with that plan, it's always great if you can have some quantifiable measures, you know, like what's the objective? And then what are the known outcomes of implementing that? And if we're on point, then we predict something and we get it. And if we miss, then we predict something, we get something different. Well, why did we get something different? And then we can make adjustments from there. Yeah.
Well, you know, thinking back to what you're talking about, diabetes, right? And just how it continues to go and skyrocket. And, but yet there's all this information, all these studies being done, and so they don't necessarily line up. So how much, in my mind, I'm just like, well, how much of it for people is just knowing what to do or not to do as far as when it comes to nutrition and fueling your body and what you're eating, and like just mindset, right? Just shifting someone's mindset, their habits, their routines, like their lifestyle as a part of that. Like how big of a piece is that to it? Is that something that's overlooked? Is that something that, is it a factor?
You know, when you dig around and look at behavior change, one of the really key features, and this is like if somebody manages to quit smoking, modify drinking habits, lose weight, the folks that are successful usually have a pretty good social support scene. And the flip
Mhm.
side of that is the people who struggle, their social support is usually not on board with what they're up to.
Yeah.
And this can be really a challenge. Like one of the most common things that we would hear when we had a brick and mortar gym was, how do I get my wife, how do I get my husband to do the thing that I'm trying to do? And not infrequently, the spouse or significant other would actively undermine the person,
Yeah.
because whatever brought them together, the way the gears meshed previously, when that person starts changing, the gears don't really mesh the same way, and the
Mhm.
other person either needs to grow or they end up growing apart. And so we saw a lot of people bail on the process or bail on the relationship. And I think that that's one of the benefits of things like jujitsu schools, CrossFit gyms, is that you do have that community there
Yeah.
that can offer support and kind of help provide some lane lines for you, and have kind of a reality check for you when you're struggling. And so when folks try to affect change in a silo, in isolation, it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think to some degree, this is why we also see women succeed to some degree disproportionately in the story, because they tend to maintain better social connections. Women tend to be earlier adopters. They tend to
Yep.
network a little bit better. Like men just kind of like suffer in silence, don't really
Yeah.
reach
Right.
out to their buddies. And so we tend to see more success in women, and better success in general. And I think a lot of it falls back to the social connectivity, and finding, people that can support them and moving through this whole thing.
Yeah, that's an important piece, and I hadn't really thought of that before. But yeah, what would be some ways that you could create some more of that community, right? To help some of these people out through that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, who are some people in your life, whether it's leaders, coaches, mentors, that have impacted you directly, indirectly, that you've looked up to along this path that you've been on? And maybe more importantly, like really, what are some of the things that you've taken from them, that you've learned, that you've implemented, that have helped you to kind of become the person that you are, the leader that you are, in your space?
Man, so Greg Glassman, the founder of CrossFit, has been hugely influential for me. And it's funny, like he and I have had multiple kind of fallings out, fallings in.
Yeah.
Currently, we're in, and
You're in.
we
Okay.
communicate a lot.
Yeah.
But Greg's legitimately a genius, like brilliant guy, thinks
Yeah.
about just so many interesting things at such a high level. But one thing that I learned from him is that he, like some other very smart people that I've seen, is right about so many things that he assumes he's right about everything. And in certain circumstances, he's had people that I'll say, like myself, that maybe had a little bit of an insight about some of what they were up to, and they would have done well to pause and give some airplay to the notion that, like, yeah, okay, you're right a lot, but you might
Yeah.
be out in the weeds on something like this. And so that was something that is informative and influential for me about what not to do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I really try to surround myself with people that I notice that they will call me out on stuff. They're like, "Hey, have you thought about this?" Or I'm thinking about moving somewhere or whatever. And I throw out some ideas, and they're like, do you know anything about that location? And they will really give me some pushback on it. And then I do the crazy thing and actually listen to them and think about it.
Yeah.
And in that way, like you if you can surround yourself with people that you trust and that care about you, and they're reasonably smart, like you can go from kind of average intelligence to genius level intelligence, because you're able to augment your knowledge and your experience with these other people. So you don't need to be on the hook for every single thing. And
Mhm.
good buddy of mine, John Welborn, he's a NFL veteran, played 10 years in the NFL. And that guy has lived like 50 different lives. Like he has made really good friends with people, say like in the special operations community, in particular the SEAL teams.
Yeah.
And he got in and started doing technical shooting, pistol, carbine, long rifle. And John will go out shooting with SEAL teams, and he'll shoot middle of the pack for a SEAL team, you know.
Mhm.
And he just finds people that are exceptional at what they do. He shows up on day one with his white belt on, and he's proud of the fact that he's an ignorant beginner. And then in 2 years, he knows 85% of what somebody who's been doing something for 20 years,
Yeah.
because he will expose his ignorance in the places where most people will tend to try to protect their ego by
Yes.
putting on a veneer of
Yeah.
competence. He's exactly the opposite. He actually pressure tests everything that he doesn't know so that he can shorten the cycle of being dumb. And then he learns from these people. And I've seen very few people do that in the same way that John does. He learned welding over the last like 3 or 4 years. And people who've welded for 20 years, they look at his beads and stuff like that. And they're like, how long have you been doing this? And he's like, 2 years. And
Yeah.
then that's where he takes pride in it, because
Yeah.
he gets
Right.
almost as good as they are. And he has 10 times less time in the trenches. But it's the, something I've learned from John is to be very process oriented and try not to arrive with a lot of preconceived notions. If you're going to do something, have a beginner's mind, and then really look at the process and be critical of the process. And does the process include feedback so that you can tell when you're doing it both right and wrong? And so I would, two major influences being Greg Glassman, and learned an enormous amount from him, both in what to and not to do. And then for Wellborn, he's just been an incredible friend and a real kind of beacon of how to improve yourself, because guy is so accomplished. He's had so much success, but he just keeps on sticking himself in these new situations where he's a raw recruit, and then he'll give himself 2, 3, 4 years, and then he's very respectable at his skill set in that area. And the process that he applies to that, I've gotten better at doing that, whereas before I would tend to be more the person like, oh, I want to go read a YouTube deal and show up and look like I know what I'm doing. It's like, no, talk to the expert, take your lumps, be a dummy for a while, and then shorten that cycle of being a dummy.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. That's great perspective too. And just to be able to be open to see that in others, and be able to take that on and try it on for yourself. You know, it reminds me, my daughters and my son, they just started karate. Their very first day, the next class is getting ready, and they're waiting behind, and they got, you know, blue belts and black belts and brown belts, and they're but they're about the same age. And she's just like, oh man, Daddy, this is like, I don't even have a white belt. Look at all these kids are the same. I'm like, yeah, they're the same age as you. Just they've been doing it longer. Like, that's why you're here. They all started right where you were in this class, and so I love that. It's a great lesson. What's a big vision for you? You know, what you know, as you continue to make this impact, continue to be incredibly dedicated to what it is that you're doing, with all that you do in the books, the podcasts, you know, the seminars, everything else that you go in to educate and help and to continue to learn inside of nutrition. What's a big vision for you, you know, over the next 5 years, let's say? Like, what kind of impact are you really looking to make?
Yeah. So over my shoulder, we have the Healthy Rebellion radio. Earlier this year, we woke up and our site traffic had cratered. It was 97% lower than what it had been in recent history. And we started doing some poking around, and it looked like there was a Google algorithm update that had really impacted a lot of folks in the kind of alternative medicine, low carb, paleo space and whatnot. And it's unclear still what the exact driver was for that, whether Google was curtailing access specifically to this information. It's also possible, and actually more likely, that Google is just figuring out that people are making a living off of their standing within Google, and they're like, yeah, you need to pay to play, and so there may be some way of trying to goose people into that. But the net result was that all the work that I've done was effectively like erased from the interwebs. You know, unless you knew to look Robb Wolf What the Health movie review, you're never going to find it. Whereas, so there's a vegan kind of documentary movie called What the Health. I did a review of it, and it was the number 1 or number 2 return on Google for a year, 2 years. And now it's like page 35. And so this thing, it just kind of disappeared. So we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. And backing up a little bit, I'm on the board of directors of a medical clinic in Reno, Nevada. And when I plugged into this facility about 7-8 years ago, they had just wrapped up a 2-year pilot study with the Reno Police and Fire Department. They had identified 40 people at high risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. We modified their sleep, exercise, food as best we could within this kind of ancestral health framework. And the changes in their blood work were so profound that it's estimated that the pilot study alone saved the city of Reno $22 million with a 33-to-1 return on investment. Like, it's just amazing stuff.
That's awesome.
And naively, I was like, oh, I'm going to take this and scale it and change medicine, and 8 years later, like I have not changed medicine. We've had a decent amount of success getting this program out to self-insured captives. Self-insured captives are usually kind of medium to small to medium businesses that really deal with the healthcare costs of their folks directly. It's not like a Blue Cross Blue Shield where there's just this weird third party payer shell game that's going to go on until it kind of fails. Like these self-insured captives are feeling the real exponentially increasing healthcare costs, and they are looking for ways to mitigate that. So for a long time, I've known that this ability to identify risk, like what we did with this risk assessment program using advanced testing, was really powerful. But then I've also known there's a really desperate need for people to have a different payer solution. The current insurance model is pretty broken. And so I've been working for quite a while investigating some options around things called health shares or health savings accounts. And so we're investigating that. And the goal ultimately is to have a system where people could step out of the third-party payer insurance system, be part of a health share, get this advanced testing to identify what their real metabolic health and risk is, and then to the degree necessary, plug them into functional medicine practitioners, health coaches to support them on their journey of remaining healthy. And so we have a 5-year goal of getting 1 million people out of the sick care system. And my definition for that is that we identify your metabolic risk, we get you out of the third-party payer system, and we get you hooked up with some sort of functional medicine practitioner so that when you need medical intervention, it's actually dealing with root cause and not just chasing symptoms.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah, myself personally, we did the same thing. We're part of a shared plan. We have been for 3 years now, and it's incredible. Mm-hmm. It's just been great. So I love to hear that. Why do you think, you talked about how, man, 8 years ago, you made that impact, you had these great results, and you thought you're going to kind of take over the world or change the world with that. And it hasn't happened. Like what was the biggest obstacle there?
So there were a couple of things. One of them, I was a dummy, and I didn't remotely understand the magnitude of what I was up to. Another piece is that right around that time, we had a change in the political scene, and a lot of what we wanted to do became either difficult or illegal. Like there was really a push to try to get people into like a single payer type of scenario. And so it became really hard to be able to do something like that. More recently, not only are MediShares more popular and have broader latitude. Historically, MediShares have only been an outgrowth of religious organizations. And now you can actually have a secular organization that can offer a MediShare. And so, and I've just learned a ton of things like how to align incentives. But it's interesting. We were, maybe 6 years ago, we were like in the 11th hour looking at, we had put together a business proposal around this risk assessment program. And we had people that were reviewing the deck and were potentially going to put some significant money into funding this thing. And I had a buddy of mine who's very good at business look at what we had. And he was like, how confident are you of these numbers? And if I was honest with myself, the number of people that were able to pay for insurance and then turn around and pay for advanced testing, it was going to be a really small number, and a number small enough that like the risk and the squeeze necessary to build this business was just not going to be there. If I lied to myself about the number of people that would do that, it was like, oh yeah, we've got a business here. But the fact that now we have a legit alternative to the, potential alternative to the third-party payer insurance system. So like for my family, we had a HSA, health savings account, and a catastrophic plan, which we still paid for all medical stuff out of pocket. Like it was just a stopgap in case I got hit by a bus or something, but we were paying $1,800 a month for that. Yeah. And when we shifted to a health share, it went to $510 or something. And so like even taking a little bit of that spread and then folding it back into the program offerings so that every single person has a legit certified health coach that helps steward them through their process and whatnot, in addition to just a bigger community. Like these are the things that I've learned over the last maybe like 5 years. We did a lot of work with the Chickasaw Nation. They are facing the same problems that everybody in developed countries are facing. And what was interesting is they had arrived at largely the same solutions: functional medicine, ancestral health model, interfacing with gyms, an online community-based interface to get network effects to support people changing. And that was cool. Like if you're going to be an idiot, it's always nice for confirmation bias. It's like, well, I think this and those guys think this, so we must be right, and either we saw the same problems and solutions, or we were both equally goofy in thinking about that. But I learned a lot, and it was validation, I guess, that we were on the right track with this stuff. Yeah.
That's incredible. I love it. What's, I want to respect your time here. So as we wrap this up, what are one or two things you could leave with the listeners to maybe just help them move forward a little bit in their life?
Man, one of the biggest challenges that I see people kind of fail on is they don't delineate goals. Like, what do you want? And this is health or finances or whatever. And I'll use health because that's kind of more my wheelhouse. But again, people will say, should I do a ketogenic diet and 21-hour fasts and on and on and on and on?
Right.
And I'm like, I don't know. Who are you and what do you want to do? Like, what's the goal? And if we know who you are, where you are, and where you want to go, then there's kind of an implicit roadmap that grows out of that. But what I find all too often is people have not really delineated what it is that they want. What's the primary focus? And a primary focus doesn't mean that you can't accomplish other things. Sometimes if I need to go buy groceries, if there's a hardware store and some things along the way, then it may be amenable for me to get those things coming and going. But sometimes these peripheral things are completely at odds with the primary goal, like leaning out and gaining muscle mass. It's doable, but if you've already been training for a while, you kind of need to pick one or the other. Like a brand new, a beginner to strength training, they can both gain muscle and lose body fat at the same time, and it's miraculous. And then if you've done any amount of training, that shit never happens ever again.
That's right.
And so in that situation, it becomes critical. What's the one thing you want to do? Well, I want to gain 10 pounds of muscle, but I want to be a couple of percentage points lower in body fat. Okay, let's focus on gaining you 5 pounds of muscle, and then we'll lean you out a little bit. And then we'll gain you 5 more pounds of muscle and then lean you out a little bit. So we have to do some stair step things with the goal setting and delineating how we're going to do it and all that stuff. But the number one thing that I see hamstring people is that they just don't delineate a goal. Like, what is the thing that they want to accomplish? And this applies to every facet of life. But once you really pin down what your goal is, you have to determine is it reasonable? And then, if it's within the realm of possibility, then you ask some questions around, is the work necessary to get that reasonable, but we can start really having some conversations about how we can go after this. But all too often, I feel like people get buried under that information overload, and they feel like they should be doing everything all at once. And then we end up doing nothing.
Yeah. They get paralyzed, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
just like,
Yeah.
what to do. Someone that's not going to do anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. And, what are some ways that we can find out more about you or follow you and what you got going on?
Yeah. So the Healthy Rebellion Radio is where we do our podcast, and it's a Q&A format. It's a live call-in show. And then also I do expert interviews. So checking that out, like, people will stay on top of virtually everything that I'm up to. We also have the Healthy Rebellion, which is a pay site where we have a community that folks go to. And those are kind of the two main areas that I'm hanging out these days. I've mainly ducked off of social media. I do a little bit on Instagram, but mainly focusing on the folks that are in the Healthy Rebellion.
Great. I appreciate you coming on today and giving us some of your time. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Huge honor. Thank you. Thank you.